The South Pacific, April 1943. War had burned across the islands for more than a year. In Tokyo, the architects of Japan's empire still believed they could control the tide, but in the dark offices of intelligence rooms from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal, a new advantage was quietly shaping history, information. Codebreakers, exhausted and half, blind from weeks of deciphering Japanese communications, had begun to piece together a message that would alter the course of the Pacific War. It was short, precise, and routine in appearance, an itinerary, but the name attached to it made hearts stop. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, was about to visit the front lines. For the Americans, Yamamoto was not merely an enemy commander. He was the symbol of Japan's daring, intelligence, and audacity. Destroying him would not just avenge Pearl Harbor, it would shatter Japanese morale and prove that even their most protected leaders were vulnerable. Yet to strike at him meant flying deep into enemy-held skies, across hundreds of miles of ocean, with a precision that left no margin for error. The operation would test the limits of skill, courage, and sheer luck. In a nondescript building on Hawaii's Pearl Harbor base, naval intelligence officers gathered around decoded fragments. They cross-checked times, call signs, and weather notes. When the full picture emerged, it was almost unbelievable. On the morning of April 18, 1943, Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul on New Britain Island to the small airstrip at Ballali in the Solomon Islands, near Bougainville. He would be escorted by a small formation of Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers and 6-0 fighters. His schedule was detailed to the minute: takeoff, landing, inspection, and return. It was a glimpse into the enemy's diary. Admiral Chester Nimitz approved the intelligence at once, but the decision to act lay with Admiral William F. Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area. Halsey's response was immediate and blunt: tally-ho. The order went to the Army Air Force's 339th Fighter Squadron, based on Guadalcanal. 16 P-38 Lightnings would carry out the mission. Only they had the range to reach Yamamoto's route, over 400 miles each way, and still fight. The plan was to intercept him at the exact moment his aircraft appeared over Bougainville. Every minute mattered. The pilots studied the timing over and over. They would leave Guadalcanal at dawn, fly at wave, top height to avoid radar, and climb only at the last moment. There would be no second chance. Captain Thomas G. Lanphier Jr. and First Lieutenant Rex T. Barber led the strike element. They were young, confident, and aware of the enormity of their task. Each pilot was told the identity of the target, but sworn to secrecy. Not a single word could leak. If Japan realized its codes were broken, the entire advantage would vanish. Even the men on the ground fueling the planes were told only that it was a special interception. At 7:00 a.m. on April 18, 1943, the Lightnings lifted off the coral runway of Henderson Field, their long-range tanks glinting in the rising sun. They vanished over the sea, skimming just 50 feet above the waves. Below them, the Pacific stretched like glass, endless and indifferent. As the American formation neared Bougainville 2 hours later, they climbed through scattered clouds to 10,000 feet. Ahead lay the mountains cloaked in jungle and mist. The pilots were tense, scanning the horizon. Then, almost exactly on schedule, 2 dark specks appeared against the sky. Twin-engine Betty bombers glinting silver in the sunlight with a thin escort of Zeros above. It was Yamamoto's flight. The trap had worked. Lanphier radioed a brief order, and the Lightnings split into attack sections. Barber dove on the bombers while Lanphier turned to engage the escorting fighters. The sky erupted into chaos tracers, engine roars, and twisting contrails. Barber's guns tore into the lead Betty, striking its right engine and wing root. Flames erupted instantly, trailing a thick black plume. Inside that aircraft sat Admiral Yamamoto, his aide, and several staff officers. The bomber rolled, lost altitude, and disappeared into the jungle canopy below. The second Betty tried to escape at low altitude, pursued by Lieutenant Bespy Holmes, but it too was damaged and crashed into the sea. The fight was over in minutes. The Americans turned for home, skimming once more at wave. Top height, fuel nearly gone. They landed at Guadalcanal just before noon, exhausted but victorious. What they did not yet know was the full confirmation of their success. Deep in the jungle of Bougainville, Japanese search teams hacked their way through tangled vines toward a column of smoke. They found the wreckage of Yamamoto's bomber in a ravine, its fuselage broken, engines still warm. Bodies were scattered nearby, burned and mangled. Yamamoto himself was seated upright under a tree, still strapped to his seat, his white gloves pristine, his sword by his side. He had been killed instantly, a bullet passing through his jaw and out the back of his head. Even in death, he seemed calm, as though watching the outcome of his own gamble. The search party built a small shrine, saluted, and carried his remains back to Rabaul with solemn ceremony. When news reached Tokyo, the reaction was a mixture of disbelief and shock. For days, the military kept Yamamoto's death secret, hoping to preserve morale. But rumors spread quickly, and on May 21, 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy formally announced that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had died in action. The nation mourned deeply. Thousands lined the streets as his ashes were brought to Tokyo. The government declared him a god of war, a martyr to the empire. Yet beneath the ceremony lay a quiet despair. The man who had guided Japan's naval strategy with unmatched precision and caution was gone. His successors lacked his foresight, and the fleet he had built was slowly being ground to dust by American industry and firepower. For the Allies, Yamamoto's death was a stunning psychological blow to Japan and a moral victory after the humiliation of Pearl Harbor. Yet it was also a moment of reflection. The mission, though brilliantly executed, raised ethical questions. Was it right to target a single individual even in wartime? President Roosevelt had personally approved the strike, seeing it as a legitimate military operation. Yamamoto was a combat commander, not a civilian. Still, the secrecy surrounding the code-breaking had to be maintained. Officially, the Americans claimed that reconnaissance patrols had sighted his aircraft by chance. The truth, that the Japanese naval code JN-25 had been broken, remained hidden for decades. In the months that followed, Japan's naval command struggled to recover. Admiral Mainichi Koga succeeded Yamamoto, but lacked his charisma and authority. The Pacific theater was changing rapidly. The Allies had seized the initiative, moving north through the Solomons, New Guinea, and toward the Marianas. Each battle further eroded Japan's strength. Without Yamamoto's careful balance of aggression and prudence, the Imperial Navy became increasingly desperate, committing to risky operations that cost thousands of lives. To understand why Yamamoto's loss mattered so much, one must remember who he was. Educated in the United States at Harvard University, he had seen the industrial might of America firsthand. He understood that Japan could not win a prolonged war. His famous warning to his government before Pearl Harbor had been prophetic. For 6 months to a year after war begins, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But after that, I have no expectation of success. He was right almost to the day. From December 1941 to mid-1942, Japan dominated the Pacific. Then came Coral Sea, Midway and Guadalcanal, the slow unraveling of the empire's dreams. By 1943, Yamamoto knew Japan was fighting a losing battle, but he continued his duty with stoic resolve. His inspection tour in April was meant to raise morale among frontline troops who were weary and undersupplied. Instead, it became his final journey, the mission that ended his life, later known as Operation Vengeance, remained one of the most precise and daring aerial assassinations in history. Every aspect depended on perfect navigation. The P-38 pilots had no modern GPS, no radar, only compasses and stopwatches. They flew over open water for more than 400 miles without radio chatter, using dead reckoning to reach a tiny point on the map. Any mistake would mean fuel exhaustion and death at sea. That they found their target within minutes of its expected arrival was a testament to skill and discipline. In later interviews, Rex Barber recalled seeing the enemy bombers appear exactly where they were supposed to be, like a page torn from a mission briefing. Years later, the question of who fired the fatal shots that killed Yamamoto became a subject of controversy. Both Lanphier and Barber claimed the credit. Official reports credited Lanphier at first, but later evidence, including trajectories and eyewitness accounts, suggested Barber's burst had struck the Admiral's plane. The dispute continued long after the war, though both men agreed on one thing, that they had been part of something far greater than themselves, a mission whose echo would last for generations. Even in death, Yamamoto's legend endured. To his countrymen, he remained a tragic hero, a man torn between loyalty to his emperor and his understanding of America's overwhelming power. To his enemies, he was respected as a formidable strategist, one who had fought honorably and brilliantly. American officers, including Nimitz himself, later admitted a sense of admiration. He was a worthy adversary, Nimitz said, and his loss was a turning point for Japan. In the decades since, historians have debated whether the killing of Yamamoto truly shortened the war. Some argue that Japan's defeat was already inevitable by 1943, that removing him only hastened internal disarray. Others believe his leadership might have prolonged Japan's resistance, delaying Allied advances and costing countless more lives. What is certain is that his death symbolized the moment when Japan's strategic initiative died with him. From then on, the empire would fight defensively, inch by inch, island by island, until its final collapse in 1945. The jungle where Yamamoto's plane crashed has long since been reclaimed by nature. Trees twist through the wreckage, vines coil around the rusted engines, and the sounds of insects echo where once thunderous engines roared. But every year, Japanese visitors still come to that remote spot on Bougainville, guided by locals who remember the story. They leave flowers, small flags, and sometimes origami cranes. It is said that when the wind blows through the palms, one can almost hear the faint hum of aircraft, ghostly echo of that fateful morning when history turned on the death of one man. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sent ripples through every level of Japan's command. For those in the Imperial Navy, it was like losing the heart of their fleet. In his years as Commander-in-Chief, Yamamoto had been more than a strategist. He had been a symbol of precision, intellect, and honor. Officers spoke of him not as a bureaucrat, but as a warrior, philosopher, a man who embodied the spirit of the old samurai while understanding the demands of modern warfare. His letters home revealed a man torn between loyalty to his emperor and a haunting foresight that Japan's path would lead to ruin. When word spread through Rabaul that his plane had not returned, disbelief gripped the airmen. Some refused to accept it, insisting that the Admiral's luck was too strong, that he would appear again at dawn. But as the hours passed, hope turned to silence, the silence of realization. When his body was brought back to Rabaul, every sailor, mechanic, and officer stood at attention along the runway. The wreckage had been carefully collected, his personal effects sealed. Among them was the sword that had been presented to him by the Emperor himself, its scabbard still gleaming despite the jungle mud. The medical report concluded that he had died instantly. His posture, still upright in the chair, was said to have been dignified, the kind of composure that had defined his entire career. Those who saw him wept openly, a rare sight in a culture that prized restraint. To them, Yamamoto's death was more than the loss of a commander. It was the loss of a father figure who had carried the burdens of an entire navy upon his shoulders. The imperial headquarters in Tokyo reacted cautiously. For weeks they debated how to handle the news. The morale of the nation was fragile. The defeat at Guadalcanal had already shaken faith in victory, and the navy's losses were mounting. The government feared that announcing Yamamoto's death would crush the spirit of the people. So they concealed it. The official story claimed he was ill, resting after months of command. Behind closed doors, however, preparations for a state funeral began. Artists were commissioned to paint his portrait, poets wrote verses comparing him to fallen samurai, and shipyards across Japan hung black banners in secret mourning. When the news finally broke on May 21, 1943, the entire empire seemed to stop. Schools closed for the day, trains carried wreaths to shrines, newspapers printed his portrait framed in black borders. At the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito himself bowed his head and issued a rare public statement, praising Yamamoto as the sword and shield of our seas. His ashes were placed in a lacquered urn and transported through Tokyo in a slow procession of soldiers and civilians who lined the streets in silence. No cheering, no music, only the sound of thousands of people bowing as the urn passed by. But beneath the solemnity there was fear. Officers within the Navy knew what his death truly meant. Yamamoto had been the one man capable of balancing ambition with reason, aggression with caution. Without him, Japan's naval command fractured. Younger admirals, eager for glory, began pushing for reckless operations. Others fell into despair. The vacuum of leadership opened the door to chaos. Admiral Mainichi Koga, Yamamoto's successor, was competent but lacked his predecessor's genius for strategy. His tenure would be marked by uncertainty and disastrous losses. For the Americans, the aftermath of Operation Vengeance was both triumphant and sobering. In the intelligence rooms of Pearl Harbor, analysts toasted the success quietly. They had achieved what many believed impossible, an interception based entirely on decrypted intelligence. Yet the secrecy surrounding the mission remained absolute. Only a handful of men knew that it had been made possible by breaking the Japanese naval code JN-25. The operation was classified for decades. Publicly, officials insisted that Yamamoto's aircraft had been spotted by chance on routine patrol. The truth, they feared, might reveal too much and compromise ongoing code-breaking efforts. The pilots themselves returned to their duties almost immediately. There were no parades, no speeches, no medals at first. They were told to keep silent, to forget what they had done. But the experience marked them forever. Rex Barber later recalled that the mission was the most intense 20 minutes of his life, a blur of adrenaline, precision, and noise. When his guns struck the lead bomber, he had no time to think of the man inside. Only later, when reports confirmed that the target had been Yamamoto, did the gravity sink in. Barber said he felt no joy, only relief that the mission had succeeded and sorrow that war required such acts. Tom Lanphier, on the other hand, viewed it as the crowning moment of his career. He gave interviews, wrote articles, and became a public figure in post-war America, known as the man who shot down Yamamoto. The two men's friendship dissolved into rivalry. For decades, they argued through newspapers, letters, and veterans' associations over who had fired the fatal burst. The controversy lasted until 1991, when a U.S. Air Force investigation examined the mission reports and flight paths in detail. The conclusion credited Barber as the pilot who had destroyed Yamamoto's aircraft. Lanphier's official victory record was reduced. Even then, the dispute did not truly end. The mission had grown larger than either man, a symbol of precision, courage, and moral complexity. While the Americans debated credit, Japan struggled to understand the loss. In private, many officers admitted that Yamamoto's death was not only a tactical disaster, but a spiritual one. The man who had foreseen defeat had become its victim. Admiral Yugeki, his loyal chief of staff, survived the crash of the second bomber. When he was rescued from the sea, he was devastated. In his diary, recovered after the war, Yugeki described watching the first plane fall in flames and realizing instantly that Yamamoto was gone. I saw the black smoke rise and said to myself, my God, that was my parting with him forever. For the rest of the war, Yugeki served faithfully, but his spirit was broken. In August 1945, after hearing the Emperor's announcement of surrender, he climbed into a kamikaze plane for a final mission. He was shot down and killed, the last kamikaze of the war. The Japanese Navy without Yamamoto became increasingly desperate. His successors launched a series of counterattacks, including the massive A-Go operation, which culminated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It was a disaster. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were shot down, and the Imperial Navy lost its ability to conduct large-scale carrier operations. The defeat confirmed what Yamamoto had predicted years earlier. Japan's industrial and training capacity could not match America's. His death had not caused the collapse, but it accelerated it. Without his steady hand, the Navy's strategy drifted into fantasy. To the Americans, Yamamoto's killing was viewed as a necessary act of war, but among historians it remains a subject of ethical debate. Some describe it as the world's first targeted assassination of a military leader. Others argue that it was no different from attacking a command post or flagship. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's approval of the mission reflected the moral clarity of total war. Yamamoto was not a politician or civilian. He was an active combat commander directing fleets that had killed thousands of Americans. Still, even those who celebrated the success recognized its somber tone. There was no joy in the death of such an opponent, only respect for the man's skill and the tragedy of a world that required his destruction. In later years, when American officers visited Japan as allies rather than enemies, many paid their respects at Yamamoto's shrine. Some even met with his surviving relatives. They spoke of him with admiration, describing how he had fought with honor, how his strategies had reshaped naval warfare. The bitterness of war softened into mutual recognition. By the 1950s, Yamamoto's legacy in Japan had evolved. He was no longer remembered as the aggressor of Pearl Harbor, but as a tragic patriot, a man who obeyed his duty even when he believed it doomed his country. The wreckage of his aircraft lay undisturbed in the jungles of Bougainville for decades. Vines grew through the fuselage, and the metal corroded in the tropical rain. Local villagers who found the site treated it with reverence. They said the place felt different, as if something sacred lingered there. In the 1970s, Japanese veterans visited to erect a small monument. It bears a simple inscription, "To the spirit of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who fell in the line of duty." Each year, small groups of visitors make the journey, bringing incense, flowers, and folded paper cranes. The jungle has claimed almost everything, but the aura remains. Rex Barber lived quietly after the war, working as a businessman and serving in the Air Force Reserve. He rarely spoke of the mission except when asked directly. When he did, he emphasized the teamwork and the precision involved, not personal glory. He said that Operation Vengeance was an act of collective skill, born from the codebreakers, the planners, and the pilots who risked everything. When he died in 2001, his hometown of Culver, Oregon, erected a memorial honoring his service. Tom Lanphier died earlier, in 1987, still convinced that he had fired the fatal burst. History, perhaps wisely, has left room for both their names in the story. The deeper meaning of Yamamoto's death lies not in military success but in its symbolism. It marked the moment when the Pacific War turned irrevocably in America's favor. From that point onward, Japan was on the defensive, losing ground island by island. Yet it also revealed the paradox of war itself. The Americans celebrated the victory, but also mourned the necessity of killing a man who had once studied in their own universities, who had admired their culture, who had predicted that the war would destroy both nations before peace returned. His death was both justice and tragedy. In the post-war years, when Japan rebuilt from ruins, Yamamoto's image was carefully preserved. His portrait still hangs in the Etajima Naval Academy, where generations of officers study his writings. The sword, recovered from the crash site, was restored and placed in a museum in Tokyo. It remains one of Japan's most sacred wartime relics, not as a symbol of conquest, but as a reminder of the price of duty. Visitors often stand in silence before it, reflecting on the strange irony that the man who had tried to avoid war became forever tied to its most famous surprise attack. Modern historians often describe April 18, 1943, as one of the most remarkable intersections of intelligence, aviation, and fate in the 20th century. It was an operation born from sleepless codebreakers, executed by young men who had never seen the man they killed, and ended by the hand of destiny in a remote jungle thousands of miles from home. The moral weight of that day endures because it captures everything that war truly is: brilliant, brutal, and deeply human. If one were to trace the threads backward, the story begins not in the South Pacific, but in the quiet rooms of Harvard University 2 decades earlier, where a young Japanese naval officer named Isoroku Yamamoto studied economics. There he learned about the scale of American industry, the depth of its resources, the boundless energy of its people. He returned to Japan warning that any war with the United States would be suicide. Few listened. He was ordered to prepare for conflict, and he obeyed. His fate, sealed in that obedience, came full circle over Bougainville. He died not at the hands of faceless machines, but by the bullets of men not much older than the students he had once known in Boston. The story of his death has been told in countless books and films, often with emphasis on the mechanics of the mission, the altitude, the timing, the gunfire, yet what endures are the people, the codebreakers who worked until their eyes blurred, the pilots who trusted their instruments and each other, the Japanese officers who watched their leader fall from the sky and refused to believe it, the war that reduced geniuses and heroes alike to fragile human beings bound by duty. In the final years of his life, Yamamoto had written in his diary a single reflection: "Should I die in battle, I ask only that my body rest among my men." That wish was granted. His remains were cremated beside those of his crew, and their ashes were placed together aboard a returning warship. The sea that had been his domain became his grave. 8 decades later, the story still carries weight, not because it glorifies combat, but because it strips it bare. It reminds us that even the greatest wars are shaped by moments of human decision, of men waking before dawn, stepping into machines of metal and fire, and setting out to alter history. The young pilots who rose into that morning sky could not have known that they were about to end the life of one of history's most brilliant admirals. They were simply following orders, driven by training, courage, and an unspoken hope that their mission might shorten the suffering of millions. When the last echoes of gunfire faded over Bougainville, the Pacific was silent again. The jungle smoke curled upward into the blue, marking the end of an era. A man who had once commanded the might of an empire now rested beneath the canopy, his hand still clutching the hilt of his sword. For Japan, it was the moment when destiny began to close its fist. For America, it was proof that skill and intelligence could overcome distance, secrecy, and fear. For history, it was the day when two worlds, the old code of honor and the modern machinery of war, met and destroyed each other in 20 minutes of fire. Even now, the legacy of that morning endures in every story of courage and precision, in every act of duty performed against impossible odds. The mission to intercept Yamamoto was more than a military operation. It was a mirror reflecting both the brilliance and the tragedy of human conflict. It showed how victory can come hand in hand with loss, and how the end of one man's life can alter the fate of nations. And so, on April 18, 1943, as the P-38s vanished back toward Guadalcanal and the jungle swallowed the wreckage, the Pacific War changed forever. The architect of Pearl Harbor was gone, the prophecy he had spoken fulfilled. 6 months of triumph had given way to years of defeat. His enemies had avenged their losses, but even they knew that something greater had been lost. A man of vision, bound by loyalty, undone by the war he had tried to prevent. In the end, history remembers the mission by many names: Operation Vengeance, the Bougainville interception, the death of Yamamoto. But perhaps the truest name is the one whispered by those who stood in that jungle clearing. 20 minutes that changed the Pacific War forever.